There's definitely something I don't understand about the market specifically. Maybe you'll be able to give me your take on this, because we have a catalyst that normally should make the market explode with Bitcoin leading the way, even though it's not doing all that badly right now. Because as we can see here on the chart on Okojo, I'm going to stop putting my hand in front of my mouth. Since November 22nd, we've been forming a rather bullish trend. Here, we've broken a bit above the $94,500 mark, which is actually good news. We're currently testing that level, and potentially we could see an upward push. Generally, that's what happens. Let's say 51 to 49 to be pessimistic, but usually it's 60 to 40. We'll see how it reacts next week. And if we look a bit at AOLE, either there's not much volume or there's quite a bit of volatility here. And as I mentioned on Telegram, we're going to test the $98,000 mark, which will be the next resistance. Anyway, let's start off this daily update with a little jab from Donald Trump, as usual. A bit of a cold snap, especially on the markets, because in fact, he just made a simple statement, which is this one. Fed officials don't talk much, so the Fed officials don't say much. And Asset, he's good at talking. He was also good at appearing on TV, and we'll just leave him where he is. So let me remind you that Kevin Asset was one of the favorites to become the next Fed chairman. Let me remind you that Jerome Powell will be stepping down in May after 2 terms in May 2026. And so they're looking for a successor. So Kevin Asset, who was the favorite, was a strong candidate. Let me remind you, he was ultra pro-liquidity, very accommodative, and he might have potentially opened the door to stronger rate cuts, maybe a bit more aggressive. And of course, with him at the helm, the environment would have been much more oriented toward and in favor of risk assets like crypto, except that Trump made that famous statement, which is right here. And in short, it means that Asset probably won't be moving to the Fed. So the market simply understood that the scenario of a slightly more dovish Fed, a bit more open to rate cuts, suddenly became less likely. And within minutes, there was selling everywhere. Bitcoin dropped by $1,300. Gold also lost $80, and silver fell even harder, and even the Nasdaq quickly corrected. So it wasn't just a small isolated dump, but rather a full-on reassessment. We can see it here in the metrics. A massive drop in the chances of having a Fed president more favorable to liquidity with Kevin Asset. In any case, that probability is slipping away. In short, once again, it's a move by Trump that's creating volatility. And it won't be the last time. He'll actually be speaking again next week. We'll talk about it in the review and in next week's schedule. It should be interesting. I'll tell you more about it at the end of the video. But right after Donald Trump's statement, as I was saying, the market didn't take long to react because the odds of Asset becoming the president of the Fed collapsed by 16% on Polymarket. You can clearly see it here. Meanwhile, Kevin Horsch, whom we talked about a few weeks ago before Kevin Asset, instantly became the favorite with over 60%. You can see the gap, the shift in trend here. And this change at the forefront is not insignificant for us because Horsch is not at all seen as the same type of profile as Asset. An Asset, in fact, he represented the guarantee of a very accommodative pro-liquidity policy, open to rate cuts, in short, a perfect environment for risk assets. But Ash, on the other hand, has a much more nuanced, much more balanced view. He's not anti-crypto, but still he has even invested in projects like the stablecoin basis. He also acknowledges that Bitcoin could have the status of digital gold, at least in the digital realm. And he also supports blockchain innovation, notably by easing certain banking restrictions around digital assets. So he's not a crypto maximalist. For him, most cryptocurrencies are mainly software technology, a tool, a foundation that can be relied upon on which traditional finance can use this tool. But this perspective naturally leads him to be a bit more cautious, to favor a stricter framework, and to also want more regulatory oversight. In summary, if Walsh takes the lead at the Fed, we would remain on a pro-innovation path, but with much more caution regarding private cryptocurrencies than under Kevin Asset. In short, the market knows this, and that's exactly why the price reacted so quickly, because we went from an ultra-dovish and, in quotes, crypto-friendly scenario to a much more mixed scenario where liquidity wouldn't necessarily flow as easily and freely. But if we put things a little bit into perspective, we haven't seen a major correction either, so we shouldn't see everything in a negative light either. But the White House also says it is highly confident. And that's a bit of a catalyst that worries me, a negative catalyst. It's that the Supreme Court will side with Trump on the issue of tariffs. It's a bit like the sword of Damocles hanging over our heads for some time now, for quite a few days. It's precisely this risk that the tariffs might be deemed illegal by the Supreme Court. And the deadline, or at least the outcome, the verdict is slow to come. Normally it was supposed to be Friday, not yesterday, but last Friday, and all week we've been waiting. Let's say that this week the market reacted pretty well. We ended roughly in the green, so we can't really complain. So the White House says they are confident that the Supreme Court specifically will not issue a negative verdict on the tariffs. And that suggests that the White House already knows the likely direction of the decision, or at the very least that the legal advisors believe the legal basis for the tariffs is solid enough to be upheld. By the way, you know I always check my sources. There's also Coin Bureau, which has an English channel with Guy. I don't know if you follow it, but it's very interesting. Well, it's been a long time since I watched any videos, but I think they have several million subscribers, maybe 2 million. But you always have to be a bit wary of this kind of announcement, of these kinds of rumors, because they're often not 100% true. So then, if the Supreme Court confirms the legality of the tariffs, it would avoid an explosive scenario where the United States would have to pay back more than $200 billion collected from imports. And that risk could have triggered a real shockwave, and that's what worries me a bit about public finances and the markets, especially the crypto market, which is extremely sensitive and reacts strongly to this kind of announcement. Because here, in fact, we're talking about a pretty massive budget shortfall, but also a challenge to the tariff framework used by the administration. Well, that's the bad news. It's good news within the bad news. That is to say, for now, according to the White House, we might be heading towards a piece of good news, meaning the legality of the customs tariffs. We also have, and this is what I don't understand, we'll go over it. You have this chart that I put as a thumbnail because actually MicroStrategy through Michael Saylor is adding another layer, and quite a significant one at that, because last week MicroStrategy bought 13,627 BTC, while in the same period miners only produced 3,150 BTC. All right, so we have 3,150 newly created and 13,627 freshly bought. So basically, Michael Saylor absorbed more than 4 weeks of mining production in just 7 days. So practically a month. Well, a month. I'm talking about 4 weeks of production. So we've produced about 13,600. Let me remind you that right now, every block, every 10 minutes is 3.125, if I'm not mistaken. And he bought the equivalent of a month's worth directly. And this is exactly the kind of dynamic that creates massive imbalances between supply and demand, the famous supply-demand shock. And we also have a market where the creation of new bitcoins is structurally, let me remind you, limited, but where institutional players are able to buy in blocks of several billion, like MicroStrategy here. And they simply sweep up all the available liquidity, knowing that there are very few bitcoins actually available. On the platform, I tell myself at some point, this can't be possible. There's really going to be that famous shock for real. And historically, when demand so greatly exceeds supply, prices normally end up adjusting because it becomes mathematical or mathematically impossible to satisfy all buyers without the price going up. So yes, last week the price went up slightly, but that was 4 days ago, so it wasn't really last week. But we're not just talking about one sector, because on the ETF side, they're also accumulating. Personally, so am I. But because, as I told you in my daily updates, $95,000, how much exactly do we have? $95,375. For me, that's a gift. In any case, from a long-term perspective, I have a 5, 10, 20-year vision. I'm not here to cash out in 6 months. I've been buying since 2018. I will keep buying. I buy every day, whether it's through my company or with my personal funds. So, of course, I'm invested in it. This is not investment advice. Often you should allocate maybe 5 or 10%, according to all wealth management advisors. In fact, there's someone in the club who says 5%, about 5 to 10%. There are also other banks JP Morgan Stanley, who say that 5 to 10% of your portfolio in Bitcoin wouldn't be bad. I don't know how much. By the way, in terms of allocation, it would be interesting if you told me in the comments if you're at 20, 30, 50 or all in. Personally, I'm almost all in. But that's because actually I've been in the market for 7 years now. It's a market I'm passionate about. I invest in it. I make videos about it for you, so it's normal. But if you have a so-called normal job, you have something else on the side, other passions, etc. I'm not saying I don't have other passions, but if you have other passions on the side, if you have a job that takes up a lot of your time, naturally, you're going to focus on that, and maybe you'll just DCA, kind of put your crypto investments on autopilot in the background, and that's completely normal. As for me, as a content creator, I talk about this, I invest in it, so I'm really part of this ecosystem, and that's normal. Anyway, I'm not here to justify myself, but I'm here to explain things a bit, and above all, to tell you not to make too many mistakes, to diversify, whether it's commodities, real estate, the stock market, or crypto. Keep a little savings aside just in case. Also, treat yourself with things like travel, spending time with family, and so on. I think it's important to find that balance. But as I was saying, ETFs are accumulating. There are also corporate treasuries getting back in the game. And we also have the US government confirming that it wants to buy more BTC. By the way, there was that well-known event in Venezuela, which could trigger a major shift in terms of oil reserves and also in terms of Bitcoin seizures. Because I don't know if you've seen it, I don't remember the name of the movie or documentary, I think, what's it called, where they were talking about the famous Bitfinex hack. I watched it recently on my flight back to Bali. Super interesting because I actually didn't know that it was a couple, two rather crazy people who had pulled off this hack and got their hands on 4.5 billion. I can't remember the name of the documentary, but I really encourage you to check it out because it's fascinating. It's about all the hacks enter, Gox, Bitfinex, that kind of thing. It's always interesting to have, in any case, when I watch a series or a movie, it's to learn something, whether it's about the ecosystem, finance, or investing. I'm not necessarily going to watch just anything, even though yesterday I watched something with my kids. Beast Games. I watched the latest episode. It was just completely crazy. The guy who flips a coin to go from $5 million to $10 million, taking the risk of losing his spot to double the prize pool for the whole team. It's just incredible. Not to mention Jeff, who pulls the $10 million on the very first suitcase, making a poker move. But I was telling my family, you could see it on the girl's face every time he spoke. Hey, maybe it's in suitcase 5, suitcase 6. Her reaction. Anyway, super exciting, that kind of thing. That's what I love. Honestly, I have a blast. I'm always, when I watch a movie or a documentary or even a series, I try to look a bit behind the scenes to understand the psychology and so on. That's what drives me. Because just having entertainment, that's not really my thing. Anyway, I really went off track. Sorry about that. Well, anyway. So let's also talk about specifically about these kinds of macro elements. So I actually don't understand, to wrap up a bit, why we haven't had that famous shock. But at some point, it's going to happen sooner or later. So you should know that strategy is about that. Well, actually, when I was asking myself the question, why haven't we had that famous supply shock and demand, actually what you need to know is that strategy mainly buys OTC. I made a video about that. I'll actually put it for you at the end. It's over the counter. That means they don't buy it on platforms. They don't buy Bitcoin on platforms like regular folks like us. Let's say they buy it either directly from Bitcoin miners who want to sell off their stock. And especially actually when it comes to privacy, they'll try to buy directly from miners because these are freshly mined Bitcoins that haven't gone through a platform. And actually there's no direct traceability. It comes directly, it's like raw gold. So they don't buy 100% through the others here because it's not possible. But by buying OTC, you're dealing directly with mining farms. By the way, I recently saw that there were 2 solo miners who mined a block, which is very, very rare because now these are mining farms that join forces, pooling all their computing power to have better chances and probabilities, basically to win a block. And so the Bitcoins that can be earned as a reward, and it's quite rare anyway. But like I was saying, actually, I'm getting sidetracked big time. But hey, it's the weekend, Saturday, we're just chilling. I'm here to succeed. It's true that sometimes I have my outline, I have my points, and then sometimes I get sidetracked like now. By the way, let me know if this is interesting to you. But if it's not interesting, don't tell me. But anyway, they don't mainly buy OTC, so over the counter. Actually, over the counter in English and in French, if you translate it, it means behind the counter. So it's directly with a person, an entity, a miner, etc. But they also buy through the platform. And actually, if they bought directly through the platform, there would be a shock and an immediate surge. When you buy like that, 13,627 Bitcoins, it's not insignificant. All right. So there is an impact on the market by buying OTC. Actually, they're kind of under the radar. So to wrap everything up, institutional money, as we can clearly see right here in this data, hasn't actually disappeared from the market at all. It hasn't fled from crypto. For now, the priority is more on an asset, let's say, that's a bit cleaner, which is gold. But for several months now, actually, the context was almost set in advance with a Fed that was much more cautious with inflation. Even if the truthlation, we can go check the truthlation, it's at 1.5, 1.50, I think. Seriously, come on now, truflation. Why on earth don't I have the latest pricing data yet? Of course, I'm doing this live. Truflation index. Of course, I'm looking for truflation. I can't seem to get it. Inflation calculator? Oh, man. Anyway, it's at 1.57%. It was at 1.70%. It's going down. So that's actually good news, meaning we could potentially see a rate cut. By the way, we'll do a live stream on the 28th for the next Fed meeting. But like I said, institutions are turning to gold, which has surged by more than 61%. We're at $4,600. By the way, it's funny because yesterday, I kid you not, during a live, I had a hole in my, well, actually, it was more like a nail in my Tesla, front right tire. The funny thing is, I go to the garage, get it fixed, $50 for the patch. All right. Another guy shows up with a Tesla. He comes in, says he has a nail, front right tire, same thing. And the guy asks, how much is it? $50. He goes, what? And we start talking. And I tell him, hey, welcome to the club of Teslas with a nail in the front right tire. And we were talking about the $50. Welcome to LA, because here it's really, really expensive. He was Lebanese. He actually spoke French very well. I didn't ask his first name. Really nice guy. And by the way, I asked him what he did for a living. He did drop shipping. I didn't even know there were still people doing drop shipping. And then, third car in a row, I swear to you, that shows up. An Asian guy pulls up. Tesla, front right tire, a nail in it. I said, this can't be happening. There's got to be someone putting nails around here. Because the guy was charging $50, $50, $50. Anyway, I don't even know why I told you that. Yeah, because actually he had invested. He asked me, what do you do for work? I said, well, I have a YouTube channel about crypto. He said, oh, crypto is doing well. I said, listen, it's up and down, especially 2025. It hasn't been a crazy year, a lot of volatility, but it allowed for accumulation. And I think that if we have the strategy, the vision, we'll keep accumulating. In any case, for my part, I have conviction. In 7, 8, 10 years, we will reap the rewards of our patience and accumulation. But he was investing in gold. He said, I invest in gold at $2,000. It's not crazy, but he still managed to double or even 2.5 times his investment, let's say. And he was saying, by the way, he talked about gold at over $5,200, but it was interesting, an interesting conversation. Then I thought to myself, yeah, but with Bitcoin, you can expect much more than going from $4,005 to $50,002. By the way, I don't know if more and more people are investing in gold because of that. Personally, I don't touch it, okay? It is not portable. It is hard to buy. It is difficult to verify. It is not very liquid, and it is heavy. Basically, it has all of these drawbacks, in my personal opinion. Well, at one point I hesitated, like, why not? But when gold is at $4,500, I'm not buying that. Anyway, let's keep going with the daily update. Otherwise, I'm going to end up giving you a crazy monologue. But we also have CZ, who posted a rather symbolic video, first to thank Donald Trump for pardoning him, but above all, to send a clear message to the market. And I like getting CZ's perspective here. Let me remind you, he's the one who created Binance. He's the founder, but he's no longer the CEO. I think he's an advisor now. I don't really know what he's been doing since he went to prison. But actually, for him 2026 will be a pivotal year, full of uncertainty, sure, but potentially explosive for crypto. In any case, that's what he says in this interview. He explains that there are two completely opposing forces currently clashing. On one hand, we have the classic market mechanics. In crypto, that's the famous 4-year cycle. According to that, 2026 should normally mark the start of a bear market. Historically, that's what the data shows, the 4-year cycles. And this time, actually, the macro context is completely different from previous cycles. And that's true. Hasn't Jerome Powell actually delayed the injection of liquidity that we usually see? Anyway, that's where the second force comes in. Because according to CZ, American policy is now 100% aligned with crypto. And we have a pro-Bitcoin president with regulations that are pro-innovation. And we also have ETFs that are booming, not to mention Wall Street, which is accumulating. And that's exactly what leads CZ to bring up a scenario that very few dare to say out loud. And I actually agree with him in a way, and I'll talk to you about it in a moment, but it's precisely this idea of a super cycle. It's the fact that, and if you look at the S&P 500, it was kind of like that in its early days, highly volatile with cycles, and then eventually it actually smoothed out. But for him, there would be a super cycle where crypto would actually break its famous historical pattern for the first time and would instead enter a new bullish phase instead of a year of correction. And in his view, actually, if Trump injects liquidity to support the markets, this dynamic could crush the effect of the traditional cycle and extend the bullish phase. A real one, far beyond what the models predicted. By the way, let me know in the comments if you're more on CZ's side about the super cycle. I think we're going to experience a bear market that will be less significant and shorter than the previous ones. In any case, for this particular bear market, all right? Anyway, that's my opinion. And let me know if you're still following the 4-year cycle or the super cycles, knowing that it's a concept that's ignored by a lot of people. There are a lot of people who are into crypto and who don't know that every 4 years the miners' rewards are halved, which increases scarcity and therefore inevitably has that famous impact on supply and demand. As for the calendar, we'll skip over it because it's not particularly interesting. Mainly to sum it up quickly, we have President Trump's speech. It's often an event that's more unpredictable than anything else. We don't know exactly which topics will be discussed. We also have the release of the quarterly GDP on Thursday. This figure gives an overall view of the economic momentum. And also, the most interesting and important macro event of the week is on Thursday at 4 p.m. with the release of the annual core PCE. It's the Fed's preferred inflation indicator, much more so than the CPI. It's clearly the one that most directly influences expectations for federal liquidity rates, so I'll definitely talk to you about it in the daily update. So don't hesitate to like, subscribe, and sorry for the... No, not sorry, I'm not apologizing. That's exactly where I have the most fun, talking a bit about the environment, the people I interact with, my perspective, my way of investing. Which is interesting, in my opinion, because it's the more human side in a world where everything is artificial intelligence. Sometimes I speak my mind and just say things as they are. Wishing you a great weekend. Tomorrow we'll have a sponsored video with Bybit Earn, which allows you to generate interest, returns, and performance automatically on the platforms. And I'll tell you more about it tomorrow. I'll leave you with the video I mentioned earlier. I can't remember, what was it about again? OTC, yes, that's it. And I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you in any case for your loyalty. We'll catch up on Instagram. Telegram, as usual, I'll put all the links in the description on Kojo as well. And see you Monday. Ciao, ciao. Have a great weekend.